Welcome everyone, and thanks for participating in our conference call on what does engaged scholarship mean and how can we practice it in times of COVID-19. Under engaged scholarship, we understand transformative and critical forms of academic work that have the ambition and capacity to stimulate reflection, inclusion, and social justice through extensive and sustainable engagement with the communities they study. So I am Maria Rasht, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Exchange Engaged Scholarship and Narratives of Change project. In this project, we explored the opportunities and challenges of engaged scholarship, aiming to promote inclusion of people with a refugee background in the Netherlands, South Africa, and the United States. So in this conference call, we want to take the time to reflect on the question, what does engaged scholarship mean and how can we practice it in times of COVID-19? We will exchange experiences, challenges, and strategies with a group of scholars that engage with refugee communities in their work. We will do so by reflecting on what we see happening in refugee communities that we work with and how we can still engage with these communities in a meaningful way in times of COVID-19. So I will be the host of today's conference call, and Elena Ponsoni, one of the postdocs in our Engaged Scholarship and Narratives of Change project, will help me moderate the discussion. We are the researchers in our project that focus on the Dutch context, so today's conference will also depart from the experiences of scholars that work in the Dutch context. However, we also invited two scholars that have more international focus in order to relate our experiences here to international developments. So before going into the content-based discussion, we would like to do an introduction round. So may I ask all of you to introduce yourselves, including how you engage with refugee communities in your work. And let me start with Laura Bisaillon.
Okay, thank you. First off the top, so my name is Laura Bisaillon. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto, and I'm a fellow at the Netherlands Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences for this year. And my research is at the intersection of migration, health, and the state. And so I've used ethnography as a field work strategy to examine issues of forced migration, so refugee studies and immigration in Canadian context, in Iranian context, and in the Horn of Africa, so Ethiopia and Eritrea in particular. And in a prior career, I was a social worker and worked for the UNHCR actually in the Horn of Africa.
Thank you. Hanke, would you like to go second?
Yes, thank you, Maria. Hi everyone, I'm Hanke, and together with three other researchers, of which two have a refugee background. We are a research group in the University of Applied Sciences in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And we are doing a research into the search many students with a refugee background have to do and are doing in the Netherlands to find their ways up to education, higher education, and the labor market. besides, I'm also working in the University of the Arts in Utrecht, where we work also with students with a refugee background, and we work with artistic research. My background is that I studied Arabic and Islamic studies, and I've been working in higher education for more than 18 years.
Thank you. Hala Borashi, would you like to go next?
Yes, hi. I have been, I came to the Netherlands, actually. I have to start with that, maybe, as a refugee myself from Iran. And when I was faced with all these categories and the ways and the numbers that refugees were presented in the public space, and I thought, if I go in the academia, I want to be focusing on narratives of refugee. I want to, in a way, be able to unsettle these numbers, because they say something and they say actually nothing at the same time. And it shapes the mind and the ways that policymakers deal with refugees and migrants based on these numbers. So I started with narratives of refugees through life story methodology, and later I realized that I want to have a more challenging methodology that not only collect narratives but engage more and create more reflection in the process of research through methodology. So I do more co-creation methodology, reflective methodology, using the concept of Sandra Harding strong reflexivity as a source of a strong objectivity is one of my inspirations. So from that perspective, I have designed this Refugee project, which Maria and Elena are part of now, Engaged Scholarship and Narratives of Change.
Miriam Twicht, would you like to go next?
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. So Koen invited me. So I'm based in Norway, and I work with refugees based in the Middle East. So my PhD research and my brief postdoc fellowship, like I did in Amman in Jordan, was focused on refugees in Jordan, and I'm actually currently involved in a postdoc on refugee protection in the Middle East. And in my work, I'm a very interdisciplinary, confused person, but I'm mostly an anthropologist. And I basically look at people's technology use and how people sort of make sense of their experience in the present, but also how that shapes people's narratives to the future and to the past. So imaginations of the future and ideas of home, belonging. So the more sort of social, but also subjective experiences of being and becoming displaced. So I'm currently based in Oslo, but I'm a Dutch citizen. I have been, I think, since 15 years, been engaged quite a bit in refugee activism. And so I am sort of, aside of disciplinary confused, I'm also sometimes a bit geographically confused, because I do a lot of work in Jordan, but I also always connected to, if you sort of think of foreign aid, if you think of people's family relationships, if you sort of think of people's future imaginations, a lot of it is sort of entangled with what's going on in Europe as well. So I also find it really difficult to sort of separate that, and in a way also not particularly necessary, because it's also so interlinked for the people I actually work with. So yeah, that's basically what I do.
Thank you. Fabian Holle, may I ask you to go next?
Yes, thank you very much. So my name is Fabian Holle. I worked in contemporary theater and dance for the past 16 years. And I recently just graduated from a master in sociology, where Halle and Maria were my supervisors for my thesis trajectory. So very honored to be here among these very inspiring people. In my thesis, I analyzed how queer refugee artists actually in the Netherlands, they resist and challenge exclusionary social structures that they deal with, and then how they challenge and resist those through art, also collectivity, and also their queerness. Yeah, currently I'm working now at the university, the Vrije Universiteit, as a student, teaching assistant for bachelor and master programs. Halle, Maria, and me, we just finished the course as well there. And I also work as a research assistant, junior assistant within the Refugee Academy, and also in the Refugee project, engaged scholarship and narratives of change. Yeah, my engagement, so it's very new. I just engaged one time in my thesis basically, and it was part of my thesis. We asked the queer refugee artists to make artistic works about their experiences during Corona or in Corona. And then we discussed their works, the artworks, and also the role of art throughout their lives. And in close collaboration with the participants and with everybody, we then published those works on the website of the Refugee website. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Charlotte Klaus, will you go next?
Okay, hi everyone. Nice to see you. My name is Charlotte Klaus, and I am a medical anthropologist working in a clinic for transcultural psychiatry in the northeast of the Netherlands. And I'm also doing my PhD research in that clinic. And that research focuses on what's called TBS vreemdelingen, and that translates as people who have been convicted for a heavy crime whilst also suffering from psychiatric problems. And those people find themselves at the intersection of migration and criminal law. And therefore their treatment is frustrated, and I'm hoping to put a spotlight on this very specific corner of the Dutch legal system. So I'm engaged in an activistic way, you could say. But at the same time, I have to be very careful with that because I work in an organization that's part of the Ministry of Justice. So that's a very interesting position. Most of the people that my research focuses on have a refugee background. So that's how I'm currently involved with them. And before I was also involved in volunteering projects with refugee children. And for my work as a staff member, I'm also involved in another call right now, developing research about the cultural formulation interview, which focuses on centering client perspectives within the psychiatric or other types of care consultation.
Then last but not least, Koen Leurs. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me here. My name is Koen Leurs. I'm, like Laura, currently a fellow at the Netherlands Institute of Advanced Studies from home. And I'm also based at Utrecht University, where I'm an assistant professor in gender studies in the media and culture department. First off, I'd like to apologize because probably I'll have kids coming in and out, and I'll try also to be present here, but I'm also present there. My work is at the intersections of media and migration. in recent projects, for example, I've worked together with young people of refugee and expatriate backgrounds, studying through the digital and through smartphone use, everyday experiences of growing up in the Netherlands, you could say. And I work with language teachers to develop curricula to engage and include media literacy and media practices as part of language training. So I would say my approach to doing this kind of work tries and seeks to be creative, participatory, and digital. I'm looking forward to learning a lot from taking part also again in this conversation. It's been great to have been following your trajectory. Thanks.
Thank you, Koen. And yeah, don't worry about the kids. I think it's a great example of how, we all, or many of us are now, juggling with different tasks at the moment. I already said last but not least, but we have another one last but not least, Lena Ponzoni, but I already introduced her very shortly, but I will now give the word to her to introduce herself a bit more elaborately. And then to start the discussion based on the question, what we see happening in refugee communities that we work with since the outbreak of COVID-19.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you all of you for your beautiful introductions. I will very shortly introduce myself as well. I'm Elena Ponzoni. I work at the Department of Sociology of the VU, like Maria, Fabian, and Halle. And I'm also, as said, tied to the Engaged Scholarship and Narratives of Change project. Since shortly I'm, because I was postdoc, but since shortly I'm assistant professor at the faculty. I still have to get used to it. And some years ago, I initiated together with Halle the Refugee Academy, which was already mentioned shortly by Fabian, which is a platform in which we try to bring together academic, professional, and experiential knowledge about the inclusion of refugees in the Netherlands. And within these connections, we try to invest very much in increasing the impact of refugee narratives and experiences, which can shed light on why actually inclusion doesn't always work despite good intentions. So we try to engage different types of stakeholders, partners, organizations who really want to contribute to the inclusion of refugees and help from the narrative of refugees to reflect on their actions. For me personally, engagement means involving actively people that our research is about in producing knowledge, and also really actively sharing our theoretical views, our theoretical notions with them that can help them understand better their role and their actions, but also help us reflect as academics on the usefulness of these theoretical notions for scientific production. So this exchange of theory and professional and experiential knowledge is very important for me. Maybe one example is in the project, one of the projects of Refugee Academy that we're doing. We are working with initiatives for refugees that emerged in the Netherlands after 2015. And we're working with them on actually two kinds of reflection. So internal reflection on how far are they inclusive and do they manage to build equal relationships with the refugees they want to help? And also external reflection in terms of making others in the field reflect on what their role is and how does this role fit with other stakeholders like municipalities or big NGOs, for instance. So this to give you an idea of the type of work we do at the Refugee Academy. This being said, I would like to start our discussion. As you already all explained in your introduction, in one way or another, you all engage with refugees communities in your work. What do you see happening actually in these communities since the beginning of the Corona crisis, so in 2020? I would be very happy if you can share your observations with us, and I would propose that we start with the Dutch context, and then that we look at, from the international perspective of Miriam and Laura after that, so they can maybe react from their experience. So who of the scholars that are working in the Dutch context would like to start sharing their observations? Koen?
Sure, I can start, and please interrupt or add or intervene whenever you feel necessary. Yeah, I just wanted to maybe point briefly to two things. The first is, I think in the early weeks, how it was interesting and in some news discourses that suddenly people became aware that we actually have experts on how to live through, for example, situations of social distancing or negotiating family life with people living at a distance in newspaper interviews, for example, with refugees who have been going through these situations for years, and not to paint this utopian picture of how refugees were able to sustain in these relationships through the digital, but as a way of opening that exactly there's a group with experiential knowledge on how to do so, on how to do intimacy at a distance, and that this is a very much paradoxical and convoluted process. So there was in the early months, perhaps, there was attention for this, and I think this is an important reminder also for us that it's in kind of incorporating refugee studies, migration studies into kind of the mainstream of knowledge production. This is an area to kind of flip the script, which I found interesting. And in terms of seeing on the ground, I heard, but mostly informally, a lot of stories of people indeed facing longer and longer waiting lists in asylum procedures in the Netherlands context, difficulties of negotiating also homeschooling situations for example, refugee children in international transition classes schools, where schools were suspended, and heard from teachers afterwards that like their educational trajectories stood at a complete standstill because remote teaching was even more challenging, also with parents negotiating many other different demands. So maybe, yeah, I just like to maybe just raise those 2 points here.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Is anybody else of you recognizing maybe some of the points Koen mentioned, or otherwise would bring in different points?
Yes, I thank you, Koen. I think that I recognize both point of view you bring in. And I could add that in some way that we had a few interviews as well with students with a refugee background during the first intelligent lockdown, as it is called, was called in the Netherlands, and the current period. It was that during the first lockdown, we did a lot of phone calls with our students. And with some we made some walks and so, and then they were telling us that, yeah, indeed they know perfectly well how to behave in such uncertain circumstances. So they told us, well, you know, for me hardly anything changes. But that has also to do with an isolated position in the Netherlands. So this isolated position didn't change, and that is also was for me, well, very clear that it is not all about resilience. Well, it is about resilience, but it is also, yeah, like surviving, especially when you're here without your family. And then in this current period, we found out that it is harder to get into contact with people, with our students. On the other hand, they are very much working hard to pass their exams, and they are completely focused in order to, well, just pass this situation and not being on a back step. And they are strong in that, but their question for more social relations and social context is less clear at the current moment. So they are much more working forward.
Like, did they have a need for social contact, you mean? I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, that is less clear in the current moment. I was last week we had a interesting exchange between students, which they are working together. Some students, some of these have a forced migration background, and some of them belong to the LGBTQ society, community, and these students were talking with each other, and I was participating in the session. And then the students with the LGBT identity, they told that for them this crisis is very much ruining their social group feelings, you know, their community lives, and because they, once you are clear about your identity, you can live with it, and you can live it out. I mean, the outgoingness is much less possible. And then they were talking with each other, and the students with the refugee background, they said, well, for us that outgoingness was never an option. And now we use this opportunity of being so much focused on what we have to do that we really make of it what we can. Yeah, it is also a kind of resilience, but in the first period we heard much more, oh, how wonderful it would be if we could come together and exchange and do things, and so, and now we didn't hear it anymore.
Yeah, I understand. Maybe this would be a nice point to reflect on for Fabian. I don't know, Fabian, because you research refugees with the LGBTQ background in this period. So
totally. I mean, I recognize also exactly that my participants, and I'm talking about the first intelligent lockdown, they're also said and posted funny memes on social media, like isolation, nothing new, you know, being lonely, scared. It's all, yeah, they were used to it. And so this was on the one hand something that I noticed, and a lot of queer, I mean, I say queer because a lot of the people from my participants are like gender non-conforming, trans or non-binary or transgender. So this was one thing that they really, there was nothing new. And also that it was sort of like a time for them to actually reflect, because the rest of the world was in a standstill, and now they had sort of time to, like, okay, thinking and creating like artworks. On the other hand, the negative side was also what I recognize what Hanke said, that a lot of them had a lot of frustration about that events didn't happen. So like community events where art were shared, for example, like queer poetry events for refugees, but also protests and demonstrations. There was a lot of, like, in the beginning, like these Week tegen Racisme, like Week Against Racism demonstrations and protests, and they were really frustrated they couldn't participate. And also there was one sort of big event which like affected some of my participants, which was connected to something that happened in Morocco. So it was like an influencer online. They started asking to people in Morocco to go on a gay dating app, like straight people or families or whatever, to find other queer people and then to out them. So a lot of people then were outed and violated because they had to be stuck in home. And this was for my participants like a real trigger as well, so that they were like very, yeah, so they were alone in their house, but then with their minds in Morocco. So yeah, that was a very complex theme. Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about that later, but then through art, that was then actually nice for them to actually connect those worlds by creating like an artwork, actually.
May I say something?
Yes, sure, Halle.
Yes, because it is so amazing to be part of this conversation. I see exactly the two things that actually Kuhn started with. On the one side, the fact that resilience and actually survival is the mode that refugees are very used to. So for them, the crisis is not something new. This is something part of their life story, and they are quite equipped to deal with crisis. That is the first thing you see. Actually, even in the crisis literature, there is acknowledgement that during the crisis, refugees and people actually are the ones also who are in their communities quite receptive to deal with crisis. And we have seen two examples in the Netherlands, which is very important. For example, refugee-led organizations who saw that COVID-19 and all the formal institutions dealing with the COVID just forget about refugees. So they start themselves a help desk that is called Help Desk COVID-19, and they, really ask refugees about their needs. That is the first thing that's really first example that was very interesting to observe. And the second one was the older generation of refugees in neighborhoods. For example, one of the neighborhoods in Amsterdam started with this food program, actually connecting the restaurants who were closed. So they were cooking for the people in the community, and they were bringing, also mobilizing people in the neighborhood to get connected in different ways. So you see a kind of a lot of resilience from the communities of refugees themselves. But what I see happening as well is that especially for newly arrived refugees, COVID-19 has been really challenging from the start, because they have small spaces. They are confined in this, you see that inequality becomes present in speciality. How much space do you have actually, and how much space do you have to share? That is the first thing that really is important. And second, I was talking to refugees who were following Dutch courses. So they were hoping to get the diplomas. They get, the language diplomas, and then also to have possibilities for internship, because now the Dutch policy after so many years really focuses on getting refugees early integration going. So, and then they were saying, I don't have any contacts to practice the language. So, and there are no companies who would give me internship in this time. So they are really in the early years that is essential for them to build a life. They are feeling that they are lagging behind because of the COVID-19. Although they are resilient, they really, you see that inequality shows its face more visibly in this time of COVID. And that has impact also for refugees who need to have contact and to be connected to the society. So on both points that Kuhn mentioned, and the others also added, of course, I see it happening.
Yeah, thank you, Halle, for pinpointing this two aspects that actually in everybody's contribution are coming back. Who didn't share their thoughts yet? Maybe Charlotte, and then we can go to the international.
Well, just a small thing to add, I guess. When it comes to the setting where I work, it's predominantly a closed setting. So people receive treatment, but also reside there for a period of time. And that kind of limits their possibilities to use this equippedness that I do see that they have, but there's just no opportunity to kind of use it in the way that they were used to before. So what we see is that it increases isolation because the possibilities to reach out to family and friends are already limited. Use of internet, for example, is restricted. Use of phones is not allowed. So the only way to see people is when they visit the clinic, and that was cancelled for a while during the first lockdown, and now it's very limited. So that's one example.
Yeah. So you see actually that with these very, very vulnerable groups, the let's say more positive effects of the showing the resilience is much harder to see.
Yeah, it's limited.
I think we have a nice picture. I think there is a lot of mirroring between what was said on this Dutch context. So I'm very curious to see whether Miriam and Laura recognize some of these points that were made from the context that they're studying. Who of you would like to start? Maybe Miriam?
Yeah, thank you. That's actually really great. And I mean, it also, I recognize a lot from my own work and also what I've heard of people working or being refugees in the Netherlands. I had a few things that I wanted to touch up on, and that is the sort of time dimension, because I feel that in the beginning, I mean, there was that sort of, I noticed, like, and that's what I want to say later, but I sort of did notice that sort of resilience and the sort of, you know, the sort of solidarity, landlords in Jordan sort of being okay with a month not having been paid rent, and, you know, people not having income, but it was okay. There was a lot of sharing. And I do think that that's a bit the problem with resilience and the entire resilience narrative. I mean, it's awesome that we can look that sort of shift of sort of humaneness and who's the expert. That's a good thing, but we also should be aware that it's still people sort of coping in sort of marginalized settings, and there's only so much of what we can do. And so initially in the Middle East, as far as I know from Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, there was quite a lot of South-to-South solidarity. That's sort of been declining. And, you know, and people already didn't have much safety net. So there's a lot of worries of like what's going to happen. And actually sort of, so aside of the sort of anxiety of the corona, there's very much the economic anxiety. And I do think, and I was wondering also if you sort of noticed that among the people you work with, because I know that a lot of people you work with have family members elsewhere and they might have been used to sort of sending money. Are they still doing that? Is there still sort of some financial space among these people to sort of continue to send money? And what I also think in regards to the sort of resilience and the sort of that sort of dichotomy about sort of strengths and weaknesses and sort of being isolated and being connected and being together. I think also in regards to that sort of sense, like it was quite funny to me because I was in Jordan when a lot of the graduations in the Netherlands were postponed or cancelled. And I was a bit sort of thinking of like, oh, such privileged kids and blah, blah, blah. And then like, I was actually like half an hour later, I was speaking to some refugee teenagers who were sort of really, really bummed because their graduation was not ongoing, right? And I think that like events didn't happen for people with refugee backgrounds either. And even like, and especially if people do not have a big sort of, you know, do not have a lot of social gatherings in their life already, having that one event less is actually a great deal as well. Yeah, so that's basically, all right. So now I think like what has happened, what is quite good is that sort of, because I mean, what's supposedly the case is that humanitarian financing should be happening immediately and during crisis, but that didn't really happen immediately. So now there is more money available for aid, but that's very much like to me, like as I see it, it's very much like framed as like to reduce negative coping mechanisms and things like that, instead of like, well, we're giving these people a safety net because that's what we all need in these times, right? And one brief remark I wanted to touch upon what Charlotte was saying about the power relationships between, like, I do notice that similar tendency between sort of humanitarian workers who are allowed to go into the camps, who are able to sort of move around, and people who cannot, you know? So it's very much that we're all sort of more immobile, but some people are still more mobile than other people.
Yes, thank you. I think you made really very, very important points. This last one very much, but also the fact that you, I mean, it was already mentioned before, but the fact also that you stress this, the risk of idealizing this idea of resilience. And of course, the fact that we can focus on the strengths and on the personal resources that might become more visible now and that are generally maybe more invisible. Yeah, that does not, of course, can turn very easily into the risk of saying, okay, but they're resilient, so there's no problem. So the focus on these personal resources can make the fact that there are structural inequalities that become more, yeah, that become even bigger, actually, yeah, to make that more less visible. So yeah, that I absolutely agree with you. Laura, would you like to share your observations?
Sure.
What you've heard until now, maybe react on some of the points?
Sure, thanks. And I should say I'm grateful to be part of this network, right? This meeting, and to be invited in by Kuhn. So it's nice to know all of you. So what I didn't say, so obviously I'm a newcomer and temporary person to the Netherlands, but my husband's family and extended family, therefore, are came to Canada and also came to Netherlands as refugees. So in coming here, and I've been here for a couple of months now, I've had the opportunity to go into some of these smaller homes that Halle is talking about, right, in North Holland or downtown or inner city Amsterdam, and for sure close quarters. But we've sort of begun discussing about COVID experiences here compared to COVID experiences in Eritrea and Ethiopia, in particular. And so the idea that as we know, right, from our work and from our lives, right, people are profoundly transnational. So they're sort of here in body and also somewhere else in spirit, and going between the two, emotionally, financially, all these transferences as well. So what we began to speak about on the weekend actually was, the relatives are in their 30s and early 40s, and they have recently in the last couple of years come to the Netherlands, and they're just really acutely aware between their stance in a welfare state and the stance of their relatives who are not, right? And just talking about experiences of unemployment here. So they're all shift workers working in, supermarkets, and just really aware that while they would prefer to work, some are not working now, but they still have the opportunity to fulfill their basic needs at the end of the month. And so what they said on Saturday night, it was, well, no, if you don't work in Khartoum, there's no money for the family, whatever. So, COVID in Eritrea or COVID in the Sudan is really life as usual in most cases, right? And then the other part of the family were refugees from Ethiopia and longer standing. So those people are in their 50s, late 50s, early 60s, and they're also in North Amsterdam and have worked as Uber drivers and interpreters within the refugee system here in the Netherlands, right? So polyglots. But what they've wrestled with, the men in particular, is financial insecurity and the anxiety that brings, right? So the opportunities have really, to make ends meet monthly, difficult, which then means less money to be sending home to relatives in the US, children in the US, or in other places in the Netherlands or in Ethiopia as well. And so those, I just thought those are sort of like field stories. And then in terms of my researcher, researcher investments, two colleagues from Iran and one from Australia, some of whom might be familiar to the colleagues on the call here, Linda Briskman from Australia, and two colleagues with whom I'd worked in Iran. We had early on in March, we collaborated on an article that finally came out in a journal called Bioethical Inquiry. And what we did is a collaborative photo essay. And we shared experiences with COVID and manifestations of COVID in our respective societies. So Australia, Tehran, and Toronto. We had a catchy title for that article. And we really compared and contrasted those manifestations and experiences in the respective societies. And in a nutshell, Mehdi explored what going online means in an Iranian context where internet supply isn't secure or where it's state media, and some civil society resistance to this. Bahar explored the changing cultural practices, so around Nowruz, or the new Persian New Year. So what this meant to celebrate for the first time in her life, sort of different celebrations from different homes. And then Linda, in an Australian context, used the image of the boat, right? So forced migrants arriving in Australia in contrast to the luxury liners and the sort of concerns and preoccupations of infection and transmission and who's at risk and how much risk can we tolerate. And then I looked at, and this is how the research joins with this project, as well as Koen and other colleagues, but this idea of communication and proximity. And so I made the point, well, yeah, Eritreans, for example, using my family as an example, or Ethiopians have been using technology, and thankfully so, for the last 30 years to make community, right? To stimulate kinship when they are diaspora people. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually read this article you were talking about when after you were introduced, and I think it was a very interesting one. I actually wrote down one observation or question you make at the end. Like, might the isolation we all now experience lead us to become less acquisitive and more relational and cooperatively focused? And I thought, wow, that is such a different mindset. Actually, I would really think it makes us more focused on ourselves, our families, and our direct environment. But actually, I personally also feel very much connected with all the international and transnational connections and yeah, people that mean a lot to me. So I thought, yeah, it's a nice a nice view.
Yeah, yeah, it reminds me of what Kun said earlier, like flipping the script, right? Or it's yeah, sort of seeing the prism or the diamond, you know, from the different refractions ultimately. Yeah,
exactly. Halle, I was seeing you noddingly extensively. Would you like to say something?
I was thinking it would be great to have the article circulated for the people who are in the call. That would be great to read it. I really, and I was, when I was listening to you, I see actually that, you know, one of the reasons I use the term resilient and resilient capacity in terms of refugees is that most of the time, the notion of vulnerability has been emphasized and you know, makes refugees, you know, passive. The image is that they don't have any agency. So in that sense, resilience for me and also more, how to say, the resourcefulness actually of refugees in times of crisis is a way to also not forget their agency and know that and emphasize it. And then the other side is not to overemphasize it so that we get, you know, the notion of inequality out of the picture, but we have to find a balance to present both, actually, to show the agency in spite of all these structural source of exclusion and inequality at play. Thank you for, you know, very, very interesting observations from all of you.
Yes, thank you all. So now that we've been talking for a while about challenges, but also resources that this Corona crisis brings forward, what do you think this means for our role and our work as engaged scholars? In what way can we still engage in the work we want to do as engaged scholars, and how does this situation change our role in the current context? Yes, yeah, cool, okay. Thank you for offering to start again.
Yeah, not wanting to replicate this again, that we have to do this Tumblr one by one, but I was just, I wanted to signal maybe 2 points that occurred to me. One is that I found, at least in my attempts, that on several occasions grant applications failed because of Corona, where committee members, for example, had questions whether it was feasible and doable or realistic to do field work with refugee communities. They didn't believe that this would be possible and rejected applications on the basis of this. So committee members and as well as reviewers, which I think is really also illustrative for that in many instances and in many different ways. I think this also very much affects how we as researchers can produce knowledge with specific communities. So it really runs against these possibilities when indeed funding dries up. And we see this also, for example, in critical data scholars, mentioning that in a lot of the data which is gathered, for example, regarding COVID, even in the beginning, there was no attention, for example, for racial backgrounds, on how racial backgrounds really affected COVID rates. So I think this is missing, like creating a lot of missing data and gaps in our data in terms of like large scale approaches, but also in terms of possibilities to do engage kind of research when people don't believe that this is possible, particularly with hard to reach populations. And I think this is also, that was my second point that I just briefly also in response to the first kind of discussion wanted to insert, because I think what's really also what is apparent from refugee activism, but also when you look at media discourse, is that COVID has created such a void that in our kind of mainstream news, for example, and public awareness, for example, deaths at sea at the Mediterranean have completely dropped off the radar. even though death rates are really peaking, also in the last couple of weeks, there's hardly any attention for this in recent times. So I think this is really also like a signal that of this slipping from public radar, but simultaneously also that there's this increased anxiety of refugee camps, exactly as concentrated spaces with a lot of people, which are seen as threats, as security risks, as health risks. For example, in Greek islands, this has been the source of legitimating camp closures, but also here in Netherlands, where we saw in a lot of discourse that this was like raising enormous questions. Should refugee camps be open? Yes or no? With people living in close quarters posing a health risk. So I think they're like to balance more the resilience stake. I think we've seen also rampant racism and invisible racism and inequality on the rise. So I just wanted to point out those 2 points. I don't know if it's useful for this
yeah, certainly.
Point.
Thank you. Actually, I have one question, because you mentioned, I think very correctly, that it's more difficult to convince grants that you can do a certain type of, for instance, ethnographic work with communities that are considered more hard to reach. The way you present it suggests that you actually think that it is possible. Is that correct? Like, do you think that actually, we could still do that kind of research?
Yeah, I think it's still possible. And like any ethnographic or kind of creative or co-creative encounter, it's complicated and it brings its own challenges. But for sure, there are many creative workarounds that we can use as scholars and engage scholars at that, being critical and sensitive. It's harder indeed to reach people, which is also what I'm finding. And people are stressed for time and stressed for screen energy. Because indeed, when you have to rely on the digital, you also have to negotiate the Zoom fatigue, which everybody has, including us, but also people that we might want to speak to. But I think there are definitely creative workarounds and possibilities, and the work in its quality will perhaps maybe not be the same. But I think if, and this is of course the point that I try to make, so this is very much reminding me of interviews which I had where I tried to defend, yes, this is still possible. And we should do this, because if we don't do it, we don't have like alternative narratives. We don't have knowledge about what's going on. So, well, it reminds me of that discussion. So I think, yes, there's different workarounds. Like we do our teaching, a hybrid model, sometimes face-to-face, but a lot of time online, which is not ideal, but we do it. I think it's still, that this mindset, I think, is also important to think about. Yes, we can also still do like digital types of engaged research. It's not ideal, but it's better than doing nothing.
Yeah, thank you. Who would like to react to the points of Koen? Yeah, Miriam?
Well, to echo Koen, like, I think there are more practical obstacles, but I also think that the work is actually even more important, because, for instance, COVID has sort of laid this sort of foundation of lot of like biosurveillance and like applications, track and trace apps, things like that tend to actually have more drastic and more negative effects to people who are already marginalized. And I realize this doesn't like answer your question of how, but I think the need to do that is only more important.
May I add to that? Because
Yeah.
I think that what Koen mentions is very interesting, and also what Miriam added. You know, when I started with this project, I applied for it, and when I got it, I thought my dream came true. I finally have my dream in my hands, and that is to do really co-creative ethnographic participatory research internationally and create kind of waves of reflection in different countries. And then, of course, when COVID happened, in 2 cases, luckily not for Maria, but 2 other PhD researchers had to come back urgently. So they couldn't stay in the field. And that was for us a crisis, how to deal with this. This is really a crisis. How can you do engaged scholarship from distance? For me, it was a crisis, also partly because of my own framing, the way I also defended my project against the positivist distance researcher was, we are in the field, we feel what is going on, we are part of the community. So it's also our framing which is actually in crisis. Like, okay, if we really say that this is our value as engaged scholars, as ethnographers, to be part of the community, to feel what is going on, to be part of the dynamic. What happens then when we have to do that digitally? So in that sense, I think there is something of reframing, rethinking we have to do on our part. And that is, for me, actually the way, and that's why we started this question with the 2 PhDs, the other PhD researchers of the project. First, in the first period, they left, they made connections with refugee communities and they had to leave them behind. They felt so guilty. So the question is, how can you make the connection, remake the connection digitally? What is possible? And then you see that there is a lot of possibility, although, not the way you want it, but there is a lot of possibility digitally. And then the next step is, how do you reimagine your project? So you have to be able to let go of certain kind of, also securities and imaginations we ourselves as researchers have, to reimagine our role. And in that sense, it's also accepting that it's a learning process. So if we want to convince the people on the other side with our projects, we have to also rethink our frames and the ways we were defending our own kind of line of research. And I think this is a very interesting period for us also to rethink and be very creative about the ways we think about our research and our engagement. It has, and young researchers, in my experience, are very resourceful in that as well. They find ways, and Maria has been doing this, the idea of doing a storytelling workshop, and you go together and share stories and do some, you draw your stories together. How can you do that? And she's really trying to do that digitally as well. So yeah, I'm there are limitations, but the dreams still can come true in a different way if you are flexible and go along with the possibilities.
Yeah, so we also, as scholars, have a lot to learn from experts in technologies to make community. I don't know who of you said that. Maybe Miriam was talking about these technologies to make proximity and community. So we all have to learn that from scratch, basically. And yeah, I also find that the young researchers seem to be less frightened to do that. But actually, Hale, we have done that as well. Not with very vulnerable communities, but in our work with these initiatives, we have been able also to create this online learning together with these co-creative sessions, which actually it really surprised me how well it worked. And it also gives a kind of new energies to see that it does work, that like against all your expectations, it's possible to create such a feeling of being together. Anyway.
I wanted to shortly react, because what came to mind was that it's probably changing us forever as researchers. It will never be the same as before, since we are rethinking our frames and our ways of doing. We're learning lessons for the future of research. Things that we never thought possible before, we are doing them now and discovering them. So that's actually a good thing.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Would you have like an example of something that you will never do the same again? Like
well, just being able to reach out to people, to get together so easily online, that seemed so hard in the past. Organizing a Skype meeting was something, especially for older researchers, older people, was something really unthought of. And now it's common for everyone. And that's only the start of this whole wave of digital creativity. And yeah, I'm rather enthusiastic about it, actually.
Thanks. Miriam, yes.
Well, one sort of critical remark and one sort of like idea to think forward with. So Koen knows this very well, but I'm at the moment also like Halle, readjusting my sort of ways of doing research, because I'm very much like, so within humanitarianism and within humanitarian aid, there has been a lot of like humanitarian neophilia, like, oh, tech, and we can do everything with tech and apps for refugees and this and that, and oh, that enables us to maintain distance, and that's great. And now I'm doing exactly what I always critiqued. And I do sort of still find what I find really sort of important, and I think that is for, especially for us working with refugees and refugee communities, is the sort of idea of like, whatever most of what we can do, what we do online leaves behind traces. And, you know, so there is very much the sort of privacy, security, and also when we sort of speak with people who are sharing their spaces with family members, do people feel comfortable speaking up? And, you know, so there are these extra dimensions that we sort of know from offline ethnographic research, but we sort of have to rejuggle everything. What I was thinking, what I think is quite optimistic, is I was actually looking at your questions, the questions you sent, and there was the question like, to what extent can we readjust our engagement to the new realities to ensure that our engagements remains meaningful to all participants in these difficult times? And I don't know about you, and I think it's probably easier when you're based in the Netherlands and doing research with people who are also based in the Netherlands. But I was like research is has been hardly ever meaningful to all participants. And I do think that, especially considering that we are sort of working with people who have, you know, are restricted in regards to physical movement, social movement at particular times in their lives and things like that, we can sort of think like beyond this, like, okay, so how can we actually make sure that we're not reproducing the sort of power relationships that we have in our offline relationships? How can we actually sort of think of how to do this differently? So, for instance, I'm now, because I can't go to Iraq, I'm sort of now like, I have my travel budget left, so I can actually establish a paid partnership with a local researcher, rather than actually sort of, you know, going there myself. And so things like that, we can sort of try to sort of think creatively, like, okay, so how can we actually do it? You know, if we are going to do it different, can we also do it different, really different? So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This is maybe a nice bridge to say something about our Scholarship for Change project. Fabian's project was part actually of within our engaged our project Engaged Scholarship and Narrative for Change. We also were, as Halle explained, bumping against this new reality, and we were thinking to coping actually at the beginning with this feeling of abandoning part of the field, like how can we somehow creatively cope with this, and also readjust somehow these power relationships, so that how actually this idea of scholarship for change started. So maybe Fabian, would you like to explain what we did and what you did within that?
Yes. Yeah, first of all, I mean, for me, it's different because I don't have experience before that. So I don't really compare or anything or think of rethinking way of researching or anything like that. And also, I think maybe because of my background in theater and dance and working collectively in theater and dance a lot, yeah, this project, I need to introduce it. So we asked people like queer refugees that practice some kind of art. Sometimes I call them artists, but a lot of times they don't call themselves artists or they don't call their works art, which is very important because it's more inclusive. It's just like if you write, if you make podcasts, if you do, you know, drawings, DJ sets, or whatever, you know, like some kind of practice that you express yourself in, I consider it as an art practice. So I was researching that and then inviting them to make something about their experiences in COVID, which then really was like, because I also want to like echo a little bit that platform that Koen was talking about in a very different context. But this was something that my participants also really mentioned, was like, there is no platform. So they were really happy that there was at least also a platform like offered. It could be better, it could be different, it could be like more, because some people said, oh, nobody can find the website, so it should be like, you know, larger or something. But still, so this is something that was one part of yeah, that they actually found, yeah, important to have a platform, and to also not to decide what and how to talk about what they want. So they create a work which they can choose whatever they want to actually talk about, and also how. So how to express it. So you're not restricted to the language or restricted to sort of like these things, which a lot of people also mentioned that they find it sometimes hard to talk about like really difficult stuff in English or whatever, or in Dutch. So this was very, yeah, interesting. And now we're actually talking also about like, how can we continue? How can we do this more? Or how can we let this grow? And there was, for example, an idea that one of them, because they were quite like positive and happy about it, like, oh, maybe one can do an artwork and then another one can react with another artwork and then another one and another one. So to grow and to keep a conversation going and to discuss those things, and to, yeah, also have then the platform to let it, to show it to the world and to their, also to their own surroundings, to the queer communities or to their respective communities that they're part of. Yeah, so this is something, you know, as maybe an idea of one of those young researchers that you just mentioned, which I mean, it's not really very, how do you call it? Like, I don't really, it just went organically, and also because this happened, the Scholarship for Change, which is a lot Maria's idea also. So yeah, I was very happy about that, because my master thesis project was also completely in a standstill at that moment. So yeah, there was no reactions coming, and I was supposed to go to art events, queer art, refugee events. They were all cancelled. So yeah, so this is one of those ideas possibly.
Thank you. I was so much listening to all your stories that I somehow forgot to keep track of who was speaking in the second round. So maybe some.
Anke wanted to say something, I think,
Oh,
at some
sorry,
point.
I didn't see your.
I saw her figure.
Please, Hanke.
No, that wasn't the case. Thank you very much. No, I was just nodding because what I perhaps could add, that is, I think when you do this adding by way of artworks, you have this commonality in making, in makership, it is very stimulating. I think you start a community of arts, and that platform is very much needed, I think. And what is also interesting is that yeah, perhaps later you could also mix with established artists or people working in the arts in the Netherlands, and you know, just I got many questions during the last years from refugees with an arts background. How could they ever integrate and be included with their artwork in the Netherlands? That is really for everybody a hard job, but especially for them. So in that need, you really step. I'm very much interested in your work. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, check the website. It's on the Vichy website of Halle. And,
I've seen it. Yes, yes, and I spread it already. So thank you very much, Fabian.
That is great. Is there somebody else who would like to make other points? This question, yeah, Koen and Halle, maybe.
Yeah. Halle, if you want to go first, of course. No, I just wanted to quickly follow up on Hanke, because I think this this challenge of newcomers with a kind of art background seeking for ways into the art space. I've heard so many stories of people seeing particularly the art space as such a elite, exclusionary kind of bubble, very difficult to penetrate even from studies onwards. For example, I was part of writing letters of reference for a student who was applying for film school. And then he was, in his rejection meeting, it was stated that his approach was too non-Dutch, non-Western as part of the narrative. I think this is very, of course it can be an extreme, but I think it's so illustrative exactly for this feeling of yeah, trying to find ways in, but like seeing that this is also very much one of the kind of elite difficult bubbles to penetrate.
Yes. Miriam, yeah, you would like to react to this point? No. Oh, we don't hear you. Oh, we're still muted.
Yeah, I just have a question in regards to, so I've been thinking of, you might be familiar with his work, but, and I haven't lived in the Netherlands for a long time, but I know some friends of mine have been involved in this. So because, like, you know, to interburgeren, you need to speak Dutch. But if you actually want to pursue higher education, you actually have to be able to speak English. And I was sort of wondering, to what extent do you feel that puts like a barrier for people to actually pursue? I mean, beyond sort of course, people who are, you know, everyone should be able to pursue whatever they want. So at least in my perception. So I was wondering, to what extent do you feel that sort of is in the way of pursuing or finding people's routes?
You mean specifically also in this COVID situation, or?
I mean, it's like, of course, sort of like that sort of double expectation of you have to.
Yeah. Halle, you would like to react?
Yeah, I would like to react because one of my PhD students is doing research about younger refugees, and she just published an article called "Dutch Without a Dutch." That the younger refugees, because they had to speak the language, the Dutch. They had to learn the language, but they were living in these asylum seeker centers, and they used actually the Dutch in a playful manner to speak with each other, because there were no Dutch people who want to talk to them. So they had to learn the Dutch without the Dutch people. That is a very interesting paradox, actually, they show. But later, so she did a kind of social network analysis as well. She shows that later on that they speak more English than Dutch, because when they come out of the asylum seeker center, their chances to develop themselves in studies, the Dutch society is more and more an English-spoken society. Even in the cafes in Amsterdam, most of the people speak English than Dutch, and the universities offer more, indeed, more Dutch English kind of education programs. So they feel that when they speak English, they are part of the global communities. When they speak Dutch, they are refugees because of their accent. And that is also something that she's writing about, and that then you see the paradox become visible for the people who have been investing in Dutch language for a long time and they don't speak English. So for them, they fall out of the place. They are like, what is next? You know, that is exactly the kind of isolation they feel, that they speak Dutch, but their Dutch is never good enough to be accepted, and they don't speak English, and the others who speak English, they get more chances in society. And these are the issues that come up, and that's very strong observation of you, very sharp observation. But a point I want to mention, adding also to what you said, Miriam, about we have to really design our research maybe as well in this time of COVID. And related to what Laura said about co-publishing with the people in the field, with the researchers in the field, I think this is something which is also very important message for NVO, our Dutch, the organization that funds research, because for my project, it's an individual grant. I really wanted to hire people in the context, for example, the context of South Africa or US, who are researchers there, but I was not allowed to do that. I had to hire people who have a position in the Netherlands. But now, because we don't have that much of travel costs, so I can, we can engage with assistants in the fields and use the money for that. And then listening to you, I thought I really have to make a point of it when I report, and you have to at some point report back to the organization to say, this is what I have learned, that we have to engage more with people in the field and not only go there, do research. And this is, in a way, also a message to us as anthropologists or sociologists, qualitative ethnographers, I have to say. We think we have to do the research ourselves, but sometimes maybe it is better to find, as you did. I'm really curious, Lara, how was the collaboration going? You have done research with researchers in the field, and research in Iran, I can imagine that is quite challenging to write a piece together. Could you say more about that, maybe?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. This is the second piece that I collaborate on or publish with Iranian colleagues. And so in this particular piece, Bahareh and Mehdi they are colleagues and now friends. And I met them through a previous field research in Iran. And my politic within, goodbye.
Hanka has to leave, sorry.
Within this article, the politic was that although we all experience COVID, some people in some societies feel feel the implications of COVID a lot more bluntly. And so that was the politic, and also that, you know, Iranian society for Iranians, for Kurds, for other minorities and things like it's a difficult society, largely because of sanctions and geopolitics and relationships with Israel and things in the US. But it was also a way of, yeah, it was really having reflections from the ground up. And so we wrote in English, and so you know, reasonably fluent in English and whatever. So we helped, you know, some polishing or finessing with the English language. And then a prior piece that we did a couple of years ago was as a result of field research in looking into healthcare provision for Afghan minorities within Iran. And we published with an Iranian doctor and ethicist in that collaboration. And that was, you know, I think that international collaborations of that sort, I mean, they're really challenging. They're challenging to do linguistically. They're probably, yeah, they're more energetic, I would say, than or more invigorating, or very invigorating anyway, more not necessarily to rank projects, but I think they're difficult. I think they're difficult at distance, right? And so what we did is in both pieces was really forefront the challenges and discuss them from the beginning in terms of timeline, in terms of language, in terms of expectations for teamwork, in terms of authorship. And so we had, based on prior work I'd done with an Ethiopian sociologist and anthropologist in Ethiopia, where that, you know, that was sort of a less, maybe a successful type of collaboration. I sort of learned from that and said, okay, well, let's make the relations and power relations and all sorts of other relations within the research project explicit at the beginning, and let's, with humor and maybe with scratching of heads, but let's have a conversation about those in the beginning, rather than having frustrations emerge and then impasses, you know, emerge later on.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you very much, all of you. I think we have to round up this part now, because Maria also asked to have some time at the end to talk about, yeah, what could our next steps be and what we can do with all this beautiful material that we collected today from all your experiences. I really enjoyed a lot the discussion, especially also this second part. Yeah, made me think a lot about first of all the newness of certain technologies that we need to learn, and the new possibilities that are opened to us, and the fact that, yeah, we could become very creative, but maybe like Miriam said, we can also become maybe too enthusiastic and engage in this neophilia of thinking everything is possible now. But what it very much does, I think, this period, from what I hear in what you say, is reshuffling somehow the fact that we have to stop and rethink, and that all the taking for granted ways we do things are, yeah, very often not possible anymore. So we have really to rethink our role, and this opens a possibility to rethink also the power relations we are in. And yeah, we heard some beautiful examples, and Hale also has a nice message for NVO on how to rethink it also from a more institutional perspective. So I think it really opens up a lot of interesting thoughts. Now I will give the word back to Maria, who will round up and lead us to the last part of our meeting. But thank you all very much.
Yes, thank you so much for participating and for sharing your personal experiences and challenges and strategies. Yeah, I've been taking a lot of notes and I've also seen a lot of interesting things. Just to sum up the answers on the first questions was that we were starting with sharing stories of survival and resilience, but also of challenges. And we discussed shifting privileges, shifting power relations, shifting solidarities, shifting connections. And we also discussed that there is also this time dimension that, in the beginning of the crisis, it was different than how it is now. And then regarding the challenges that we experience as scholars and the possibilities we see, we discussed that there are challenges around financing, and that these also come with new challenges of engaging. But also that some challenges are maybe not new, that the role we as researchers could play or the way we could be meaningful were already limited before. So there were also these challenges that did not change a lot, but still we have to redefine and rethink all of our research, and also sort of, like Hollis said, find new ways to defend our research, because now we sometimes do the research in a kind of way that we didn't want to do research before. So we have to think about that. And we also have to ignore aspects of our research that were really, that were the core of our research, like Miriam said, like in ethnographic research, that we cannot engage anymore, and that we lose a lot of the aspects that were really central before. Then Charlotte said that, it will change our work forever, probably. But luckily, we also saw that there are new possibilities, as Elena also just summarized. There are new possibilities around creativity, but also financially, as the examples of the local research assistants, and also some new possibilities around shifting power relations in these new methods that we now use in times of COVID-19. Okay, thanks again so much for joining today. Really interesting. And we'll keep in touch.
Thank you so much. It was great. I really enjoyed the conversation. Hope to see more of each other later in the future as well.
Be great. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thanks for setting this up and connecting us. Thanks.